Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around, let's talk about the best frame rate for wildlife photography. This video was inspired by a recent conversation at the BCG Forums, and going through that thread, there are a ton of opinions on what the best frame rate is for wildlife. And as you can imagine, I have a fairly strong opinion about it as well, and I'm going to share that with you. For the most part, with the current generation of cameras, I'm a peg the needle kind of guy when it comes to wildlife photography. Almost without exception, I have my cameras set to the maximum no compromises frame rate, and we'll talk about what that means in just a moment, even for static shots. Oh, and at the end of this video, I have some advice for culling when you're shooting your maximum frame rate, since you'll probably have a lot of photos to sort. First though, 3 things. In this video, I'm talking specifically about wildlife photography and not other genres. If I'm shooting landscapes or static macros or portraits, for instance, I'm not using the maximum frame rate. Second, although throttling the frame rate may be of more concern to those shooting cameras that can do like 20 or 30 frames per second, the advice in this video is intended for and applies to any camera. Third, let's take the time to circle back and talk about frame rates with no compromises. When I say no compromises, I'm talking about the maximum frame rate I can shoot without making some sort of compromise in image quality. For example, with some cameras, the maximum frame rate requires me to shoot a lower quality file format, such as JPEG, instead of RAW. There's also the possibility that I'm using a mirrorless camera that's subject to rolling shutter, which is, to be fair, still most of them. So even if the electronic shutter is faster, can give me a faster frame rate, I'll likely go to the maximum frame rate I can with the mechanical shutter to avoid rolling shutter issues with faster movement. Naturally, there are exceptions to every rule, but those guidelines have served me well the vast majority of the time. So why am I usually pegging the needle? In short and in general, the faster the frame rate, the more opportunities you have for nailing the perfect shot. For action work, this is obvious, right? More frames per second equals more opportunities for the perfect look, wing beat, leg position, expression, you name it. Using the maximum frame rate of whatever camera you have in hand ensures that you get the maximum possible amount of granularity between shots with that camera, increasing your chances of capturing the absolute perfect moment. Regardless of your top frame rate, when you throttle back, you reduce that granularity, and frankly, you're leaving great shots in the field. And the really sad part, those shots you leave in the field may be even better than what you actually captured, but you'll never know it. The other thing is that, despite the promises made by the marketing departments of our favorite camera brands, not every frame will be sharp, or sharp where we want it. A faster frame rate gives the AF system more chances to get it right. The bottom line is that higher frame rates don't just tend to get you more keepers, they tend to get you better quality keepers. The thing is, often the difference between a good shot and a great shot is just a minor difference in expression or body position, and higher frame rates help you to snag more of those perfect moments. I've noticed that the number of showstoppers I capture seems to increase in direct proportion to an increase in my frame rate, everything else being equal. As a side note, I often hear people say they can shoot slower frame rates and still get great shots, even claiming that they can simply time their individual shots. And they're not wrong depending on what they're shooting. However, I have yet to meet anyone who can really truly time the perfect wing position of a fast flying bird on a consistent basis. I'm not sure mere mortals can do that. In addition, there's another problem. When you throttle your camera back to slower frame rates, you don't always know what you're missing. There are often times I catch a moment far better than I thought I had, and it was just one frame, despite a blisteringly high frame rate. Basically, you don't know, and you can't know, what you didn't get. So even if you seem to be getting good or even great photos at slower frame rates, there's a good chance you're regularly leaving even better shots uncaptured. Most of the time, I don't get too much pushback when I recommend using the maximum frame rate of your camera for action. However, when I recommend fast frame rates for stills, sometimes that's met with considerable resistance. After all, why would you need a faster frame rate for a relatively still or slow-moving target, right? Put simply, because the unexpected often happens with wildlife. Again, remember this advice is wildlife specific. Now we're going to look at some examples, and in these next 3 examples, I'm using 20 frames per second to make a point. So even if your camera doesn't go that fast, the principle still applies. Take this elephant silhouette. Ostensibly, it's not the kind of situation where 20 frames per second really seems necessary, right? However, look closer at the foot perfectly horizontal with the setting sun. Guess how many in this sequence had that exact position? If you guessed 1, you nailed it. The shots on either side of it would have been close and would have been good enough to call a keeper, but the higher frame rate netted me a better quality keeper due to the position of the foot. Next, let's look at this prairie dog pup. I was there shooting portraits when he stood up and barked a warning. Thanks to the 20 frames per second I get on the Z8, I had several shots to choose from, and this one was just a little bit better than the others as he had his head back a little bit more and his feet were lifted just a smidgen more than the other shots. Once again, I had multiple keepers, but the higher frame rate allowed me to pick a better quality keeper. Same with this giraffe. Once again, I was shooting 20 frames per second, and once again, on the surface, this seems excessive. That is, until the birds took off. As before, there's exactly 1 frame with them in this rough circle that you see in this photo. The ones before and after it were also good and could be like second place keepers in their own right, but this was a much better moment. Again, the trick is that when you throttle back, you don't know what you're missing. In this case, had I been shooting, say, 10 frames per second and captured one of the other good shots but missed this one, I would have still been happy, but I wouldn't have known how much happier I could have been. I'm really glad I had that frame rate cranked up. Of course, people worry about getting hundreds of the same photo when shooting at full speed. The solution is simple. Just shoot in shorter, more controlled bursts, which is honestly how you should be shooting anyway. I do this all the time, even at 20 or 30 frames per second. I can pop off just a few shots at a time if I want. It just takes a little bit of practice. As a side note, my rule for keeping the shutter pressed or letting it loose is simple. For static subjects, shoot short, controlled bursts. For action, keep the shutter pressed as long as you see something you like in the viewfinder and just release it the moment you don't. In addition to helping you capture those perfectly timed moments, you can also use frame rate to help you get sharper images of static subjects at slower shutter speeds. I know, at first this sounds a little bit like nonsense, but in reality, we're just playing the numbers. For example, let's say you're hand-holding your camera and photographing a relatively static subject, but the light is getting low. In fact, it's so low that at your current shutter speed, you can only manage to get about 1 shot in 10 absolutely tack sharp. Frame rate lets you play those odds. If you're shooting for 1 second at 5 frames per second, you only have a 50-50 chance of getting a tack sharp image for that burst, whereas at 10 frames per second, you should have 1. At 20, you should have 2. And of course, you can shoot longer than 1 second to increase your odds no matter what your maximum frame rate. You kind of see where I'm going here? By using your fastest frame rate and shooting longer than normal bursts, you can increase the odds that you'll get one of those tack sharp images on your cards. In fact, I often use this technique instead of setting up a tripod when I have a very fleeting opportunity in the viewfinder. I may blast off 40 or 50 shots of a stationary subject, knowing that at least a few will fall into that tack sharp category. It's not the prettiest field technique, I'll admit that, but you know what? It works. Of course, there are a lot of variables too. If the subject is moving, that's going to really hurt your odds, or if your shutter speed is like really slow, you may not be able to get the maximum frame rate that your camera offers. Still, maxing out the frame rate and shooting longer bursts really can save the day sometimes. I know it has for me on numerous occasions in the past. Where does it end? Finally, you might be wondering if there's a point of diminishing returns down the road. Basically, when is the frame rate fast enough? In the end, I think it comes back to granularity and variety between shots. For action, once I'm to the point where there's not enough difference between shots to really matter, that's probably fast enough. The trick is, of course, that will vary by subject. For example, the fastest I can go at the moment and still get raw files is 30 frames per second with my Sony A1. And for most mammal action, that seems like it's about as much as I'm ever going to need. However, for flying birds, especially the quicker ones, I still see a lot of variance in wing position from one shot to the next, so I'm willing to crank it up one more notch if I can down the road. For static subjects, I think we're there. I think 15 to 20 frames per second is plenty for catching an unexpected bit of action or positioning during an otherwise static photo shoot. Sure, there may be times faster is better, but I think beyond 15 or 20 frames per second is turning into a game of drastically diminishing returns. Again, I want to stress, I'm not saying you need a camera that is capable of those kind of frame rates to shoot wildlife, not at all. I'm just talking about the point where we are reaching the maximum practical frame rates for wildlife. And of course, keeping in mind there are exceptions to every rule. What about culling? If you take the advice in this video, you may end up with a lot more images than you're used to. How do you sort through them all? Easy. You don't. You have to change the way you think about image culling when you play with high frame rates. You don't need to examine every single image. Instead, go through the thumbnails and look for interesting shots and only check those out. Flag everything that's interesting and get rid of the rest. The delete key is your ally, not your enemy. In fact, there are times I'll be working with an animal and end up with well over 1,000 images, only to use a single one where I had that perfect look or pose. I'm looking through my thumbnails for the top images of each encounter and then only scrutinizing those photos while ignoring the rest. Sometimes I'll use more than one, of course, but most of the time I can find a single standout. That standout is often in a sequence of similar images, so sure, sometimes that takes a bit of decision making and I may have to keep the entire part of that series because they're all decent, but again, I'm going to get rid of the rest. The key is here. You don't have to scrutinize every single image you capture. Just look for the winners, flag the ones you like, and delete the rest. If you found this useful, make sure you check out my educational materials as well. I have books and video workshops that are chock full of field-tested info just like this that I know you're going to enjoy. As always, if you enjoy this kind of video, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.